Disclaimer. The following broadcast gives a true and honest account of the events described, and all evidence and details herein are solely factual. What you are about to hear is real and may disturb you. Caution is strongly advised. Welcome to Dead Souls Social Club.
If you enjoy our show and find our research interesting, please consider supporting us. Head over to www.deadsoulspodcast.com and see how you can donate to our research and investigations and find other ways to support us. We really appreciate you stopping by. You can also find us over on Instagram if that's more your thing. Just search Dead Souls Podcast and we'll come up. As always, thank you for joining us. The University of Texas Tower shooting in 1966 is widely considered the first, ignoring the 1949 Camden Walk of Death shooting by Howard Unruh, of course. But both of those were isolated incidents in comparison to the modern-day mass shooting phenomena that seems to plague the United States of America. The current manifestation, which has unfortunately become a cultural norm, can be traced back to the early 1980s, to 1984 in particular. I'm going to discuss the 1984 McDonald's massacre tonight, something that I'll talk about without fanfare or sensationalism. The subject is a sensitive one, and I'm going to treat the subject matter with the respect that it deserves. This is the 1984 San Ysidro Massacre. In July 1984, a gunman entered a McDonald's restaurant in the San Ysidro district of San Diego, California. Over the following 77 minutes, he would murder 21 innocent people and injure a further 19 more. The gunman, James Huberty, was finally killed with a single sniper's bullet at a distance of 35 meters by 27-year-old police SWAT sniper Charles Foster. The sniper's bullet ended Huberty's rampage and life instantly. San Ysidro is a small community within the city of San Diego, California. It borders Tijuana in Mexico. It's the most southern community in California, sitting just north of the United States-Mexico border. Being the busiest international border crossing in the world, San Ysidro is known as the gateway to the Americas and thus supports tourists from many countries. In 1984, San Ysidro had a population of about 13,000 folks, 93% of whom were Hispanic, and approximately 3% of whom were white. 1984 was also the year that James Oliver Huberty and his wife Etna moved to the community. Huberty was born in Canton, Ohio on October the 11th, 1942. James was the second of two children born to Ern Vincent, a quality inspector, and Evelyn Huberty, a homemaker. The family were devoutly religious and were regular attendees at the local United Methodist Church. James contracted polio when he was just 3 years old and was required to wear steel and leather braces upon both legs in order to support with a disability and his ailment. Even though he would make a recovery, the polio left him with a limp in his left leg for the remainder of his life. In 1950, Earl Huberty purchased a 155-acre farm in Mount Eaton, Ohio. Located in Wayne County, the area at the time had a significant Amish presence. Evelyn Huberty refused to live in the Amish county, however, and left the family to become a religious street missionary in Tucson, Arizona. From then on, James Huberty became a loner with an explosive personality. He found his mother's abandonment of him and his family emotionally devastating. Earl Huberty later recalled that he would often find James sobbing in the farm's chicken coop alone. After the parents split, his father remarried a young schoolteacher, but James and her didn't get along. Family friends described James Huberty while he was a teenager as, and I quote, a queer little boy who practiced incessantly with a target pistol. Daily, when Huberty's father, who was himself moody and explosive, would arrive home, he would fire off 10 to 12 gunshots to warn the family that he was almost home. In 1962, James Huberty enrolled at community college, earning himself a degree in sociology. He would later attend the Pittsburgh Institute of Mortuary Science, where he received a formal training and eventually a license in embalming and mortuary sciences. It was while studying for this qualification that he met Etna Markland. The two got married in 1965 and had two daughters, Zalia and Cassandra. Whilst Huberty worked as an embalmer at a funeral home for a short while, his introverted personality made it difficult for him to communicate with customers, and he would regularly engage in small and petty disputes with his employers. He eventually left to work as a welder in Louisville, Ohio, where he remained for 2 years before securing a well-paid position at Babcock and Wilcox in Akron. Huberty was earning $30,000 per year by 1971, which is the modern equivalent of around $150,000. The Huberty family would soon move from Canton in Ohio to the affluent area of Massillon in Ohio. In February 1971, the Huberty family home was destroyed in a fire. James and Etna bought another house on the same street from the insurance money that they collected, and also built a 6-unit apartment building on the grounds of their former home, which they managed, bringing in further financials for the already well-off family. The couple would establish their reputation in Massillon for violent behaviour. Neighbours would recall how James Huberty shot his German Shepherd in the head when a neighbour complained about it damaging his car. Another neighbour stated how Huberty would sit on his front porch watching the neighbours care for their gardens, whilst himself holding a shotgun. Threats and altercations toward neighbours were frequent, and Etna also displayed outward volatility towards neighbours, once threatening another local mother with a 9mm handgun after an altercation which all agreed Etna herself has aggressively initiated. Domestic violence was also a regular occurrence in the Huberty household, as were complaints from neighbours about the sound of arguing and damage from within the Huberty home. When calls would come into the local police station about incidents, officers would laugh and joke that it was just the Hubertys again. That said, Etna repeatedly attempted to persuade her husband to seek counselling to alleviate his sources of stress, although he refused all forms of therapy. In small attempts to pacify her husband's temper and general paranoia, Etna would take great efforts to minimize any possibility of agitating her husband. She also developed a routine where she claimed to be able to read his future by reading tarot cards. Huberty actually believed her and the readings, and would produce a temporary calming effect on Huberty. This method would often be the only way that he would listen to Etna's advice or suggestions. To his neighbours, however, and co-workers, Huberty was perceived as an angry, ill-tempered, miserable and paranoid individual, obsessed with firearms, and who maintained a mental tally of every setback, insult, slight, or general source of frustration against him or his family, be that real or just perceived. Then, in 1982, after 10 years of working as a welder, Huberty was laid off. As a result, he became concerned about making his house payments and how he would provide for his family. A co-worker stated that just prior to his department being closed and Huberty losing his job, Huberty told colleagues, and I quote, "If I am unable to provide for my family, I intend to commit suicide and take everyone with me." Huberty worried constantly and blamed the country, the government, and Ronald Reagan in particular for his misfortune. He was so disenchanted with the United States, as he saw it, that he applied for residency in Mexico. This was a particularly odd thing for Huberty to do, since he was known to harbour extreme hatred towards immigrants, especially Mexicans. He also began to stockpile food and weapons, a lot of them, including an Israeli-made military-style Uzi submachine gun. The family moved briefly to Tijuana, Mexico in 1983. But they returned to the United States within just 3 months and moved to the San Ysidro district in January of 1984. The family moved into a relatively poor district of the city and into the Cottonwood Apartments. Weeks later, they would move on to a 2-bedroom apartment on Averill Road, as Huberty was unhappy that his family were the only white family living at Cottonwood. Huberty landed a job as a security guard and began work in April of 1984. But he was fired on July 10th, just 3 months later, for poor work performance and general physical instability. On July the 17th, 1985, the day before the shooting, 41-year-old James Huberty called the San Diego Mental Health Clinic requesting an appointment. He had shared with Etna a couple of days prior that he felt like he was having a mental health problem. The clinic receptionist told Huberty that someone would call him back within a few hours. According to Etna, Huberty sat quietly by the phone, waiting for the return call for several hours. He sat motionless, staring at the telephone the entire time. The clinic stated that since Huberty's polite demeanour didn't convey any urgency, and since he'd never been hospitalised for any mental health issues in the past, the receptionist logged the call as non-crisis. This meant that the clinic had a policy of dealing with the situation within 48 hours, and not the small immediate window that Huberty was expecting. After waiting, Huberty eventually left for a short while, but returned and had dinner with his family that evening, and appeared normal in every way. The following morning, Huberty attended a minor traffic court hearing, then took his family to lunch at a nearby McDonald's restaurant, a different restaurant from the one of the incident. After lunch, the family took a visit to the San Diego Zoo, and while strolling through the zoo, Huberty told his wife Etna that his life is effectively over and that society had their chance. This was referring to the clinic's failure to return his call the previous day, Edna felt at the time. The family returned home after the zoo. It was around 3:45 p.m. Huberty walked into the bedroom that he shared with his wife and where Etna was relaxing. He kissed her goodbye, which was something that he would normally not do. Etna asked where he was going, and he calmly replied to her that he was going hunting for humans. Huberty regularly made bizarre statements like this throughout their marriage, so Etna thought nothing of it. The couple's 12-year-old daughter, Zelia, who noticed that her father was strapped with all his weaponry as he was leaving, assumed that he was going out to target practice, like he often did to alleviate anger and boredom. But he was not. James Huberty got into his black Mercury Marquis and drove first to a Big Bear supermarket, then towards the United States Postal Office, before finally entering the parking lot of the McDonald's at 460 West San Ysidro Boulevard at approximately 3:56 p.m., just a short block away from his Averill Road apartment. Warning: the remainder of this episode may disturb some. Caution is strongly advised. Huberty was carrying a Browning 9mm semi-automatic pistol, modified to make it automatic, a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, and a 9mm Uzi semi-automatic rifle, the weapon that he would primarily use during the massacre. He also had a box and a cloth bag filled with hundreds of rounds of ammunition for each weapon. Inside the restaurant were 45 customers. Whilst mass shootings in the United States are sadly very much commonplace today, in 1984 they were an almost non-existent phenomenon. So as the massacre began to unfold, the unassuming and innocent victims in the restaurant naturally thought the whole thing was some kind of prank or joke. And they, along with law enforcement, were placed in unfamiliar territory and without any effective strategy for escape, survival, or for stopping the massacre that was about to unfold. Huberty entered the restaurant and, armed with an Uzi, he slowly walked up to the serving counter and aimed his weapon directly at 16-year-old employee John Arnold's face. Huberty pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The gun had jammed. Arnold just stared at him confused. He didn't even flinch or shy away, thinking that it was just some kind of lame joke. As Huberty checked to see what was wrong with his gun, 22-year-old Neva Kane, the restaurant's manager, who had just returned from her honeymoon, began walking towards John, who by now was slowly walking away from the strange customer. Huberty corrected the problem with his gun, then fired a test shot into the ceiling. The weapon discharged. He then took aim at Neva and opened fire, shooting her in the head. She would die just minutes later. He then immediately shot John Arnold, wounding him in the chest and arm, just before shouting, "Everybody on the ground, now." Huberty called everyone in the primarily Latino-populated restaurant dirty swine and Vietnam trolls, before shouting to everyone that he had killed thousands in Vietnam and that he intended to kill 1,000 more tonight, even though he had never served in the military, never been to Vietnam, and never killed anyone. Hearing Huberty's ranting and seeing the two people shot, 25-year-old customer Victor Rivera tried to persuade Huberty not to shoot anyone else. Huberty didn't say anything. He just responded by shooting Victor 14 times. Customers and employees scrambled to hide behind booths, tables and counters. Next, he shot 11-year-old Aurora Pena, wounding her in the leg. She was being shielded by her incredibly brave 18-year-old pregnant aunt, Jackie Lynn Reyes, who Huberty shot with his Uzi 48 times. Sadly rendering her poor body in a condition that would later prevent her family from laying her to rest in the lovely pink dress that they got for her, because there simply wasn't enough of her body left intact. Jackie's 8-month-old baby, Carlos Ramirez, who had just been baptized 1 month prior, then sat up and began to cry. Huberty shouted at the baby to shut up, then shot him in the back, killing him instantly. Next, Huberty shot and killed 62-year-old Lawrence Versluis, a truck driver who was retiring that very same day after 40 years of driving service. His family had found out that he was a victim in the shooting when they saw his truck in the parking lot on the television evening news. His death and their worst fear was confirmed to them hours later. Huberty proceeded to a family who were crouched near the play area of the restaurant. He came across a couple who were shielding their son and his son's school friend underneath the tables, covering them with their own bodies. The mother, Blythe Reagan Herrera, had barricaded her son Mateo under one booth, while her husband, Ronald Herrera, guarded his son's friend, Keith Thomas, under another. Ronald whispered to Keith not to move, and when Huberty approached them, he shot Ronald 6 times in the stomach, chest, arm, hip, shoulder, and head. Miraculously, Ronald survived. Keith was also shot in the arm, wrist, and left elbow, but he was blocked from most of the bullets by Ronald's body. Keith also survived and would later recall how Ronald saved his life and how he didn't actually feel any pain from the bullets due to fear and adrenaline. Ronald's caring and loving wife Blythe and his artistic musical son Mateo were sadly both killed, having been shot numerous times in the head and face. The story of Ronald and his family is such a heartbreaking tale of heroics and tragedy that just the mere thought of what happened makes it a struggle to hold back tears of such immense sorrow. Near to the Herreras were 3 women also hiding beneath a booth. 24-year-old Guadalupe Del Rio was wedged against a wall, shielded by her friends, 25-year-old Gloria Ramirez and 31-year-old Arisdelcy Vargas. Guadalupe was shot several times but luckily not seriously wounded. Gloria was miraculously not hit, but Arisdelcy tragically received a single fatal shot to the back of her head. She died the next day in hospital. Arisdelcy was the only person fatally wounded who lived long enough to reach a hospital. Huberty next killed 45-year-old banker Hugo Luis Velasquez Vasquez, shooting him once in the chest, killing him instantly. The first call to police to report the shooting was made at 4 p.m., 4 minutes after the shooting had begun. The call notified police that a child had been shot and taken to the United States Post Office on San Ysidro Boulevard. The dispatcher mistakenly sent responding officers to the wrong McDonald's 2 miles from the San Ysidro location, costing several precious minutes of the area not being locked down, and during which time several other victims, unaware of what was happening inside the McDonald's, would approach the restaurant. This started with Lydia Flores, who just after 4 p.m. drove into the parking lot and headed to the drive-through window. She noticed shattered glass and heard gunshots. She immediately looked up and saw Huberty through the window shooting. She reversed her car frenziedly and crashed into a fence. She then hid in the bushes with her 2-year-old daughter until the shooting ended. Then at approximately 4:05 p.m., married couple Astolfo and Marciela Felix drove into the parking lot and immediately noticed the shattered glass. Astolfo just assumed that the restaurant was being renovated or repaired, and that Huberty, who was making his way towards the car, was one of the construction crew. Huberty fired both his shotgun and his Uzi at the couple and their 4-month-old baby, Carlita. He shot Marciela in the face, arms and chest, blinding her in one eye and rendering one of her hands permanently unusable. Baby Carlita was shot in the chest, abdomen and neck. Astolfo was wounded in the chest and head. The couple managed to stagger away from Huberty's line of fire, and Marciela handed her crying baby to her husband as her face poured with blood and her vision failed. Astolfo handed baby Carlita to a stranger named Lucia Velasco, just as Marciela finally collapsed. Lucia gave the baby to a police officer, and the two rushed the baby to the hospital. Lucia held her hand over one of the baby's wounds to try to contain the bleeding, and the police officer used the hand he wasn't using to drive to contain another wound. The drive was frantic and erratic. They knew they didn't have much time. Marciela, Astolfo, and baby Carlita thankfully all survived. Then there were the three 11-year-old boys. They had just gone to McDonald's on their BMX bikes to get donuts. One of the friends wanted ice cream as well, and as they pedaled into the parking lot, they heard someone from across the street yelling at them, but they couldn't make out what they were saying, so they hesitated. It was right at that moment that Huberty shot all three boys. David Flores Delgado received several gunshot wounds to his head and died instantly. Omar Alonso Hernandez received several gunshots to his back and died a few minutes later. And Joshua Coleman would be critically wounded in the back, arm and leg. He collapsed but was still alive. He had just watched his friend David get killed, and then would have to watch helplessly as Omar, his happy, humble best friend with whom he would converse back and forth over their backyard fences and help each other to learn each other's native language, struggle until he too faded away. Joshua pondered what he might need to do, knowing he had a similarly dire situation. He laid still, playing dead, until the SWAT team would later come to rescue him, over an hour later. Huberty next targeted an elderly couple that were walking towards the restaurant entrance, 74-year-old Miguel Victoria Aloa and 69-year-old Aida Velasquez Victoria. Huberty shot Aida in the face, which also wounded Miguel. Miguel instinctively began cradling his wife in his arms and wiping blood from her face. He cursed Huberty. Huberty cursed back at Miguel, then shot him in the head, killing him instantly. About 10 minutes after the first call to the police had been placed, the police finally arrived at the correct McDonald's. As soon as the first patrol car arrived, Huberty began firing at it, shattering its windshield and emergency lights. Police locked down the area spanning 6 blocks from the restaurant and established a command post 2 blocks away. Over 175 officers descended on the scene and were deployed at strategic positions, soon joined by SWAT and Special Weapons and Tactics team. But the authorities were unsure of how to approach such a dangerous situation. Huberty returned to the inside of the restaurant and continued his killing spree. At one point, he went to the cashier counter to adjust the radio. The victims assumed this was to listen for news of the incident, but instead he turned it to a music station and began to dance. A few minutes later, he searched the kitchen area and found a group of employees who were hiding. Huberty exclaimed, "Oh look, there's more! You're trying to hide from me, you bastards!" He then opened fire on the employees. 18-year-old Margarita Padilla and 17-year-old Wendy Flanagan grabbed each other's hands and tried to run for it, but Huberty fatally shot Margarita. Wendy was able to make it to a basement utility room, however. The other remaining group of employees who were hiding in the kitchen were also shot and killed, 21-year-old Paulina Lopez and 19-year-old Elsa Barboa Fierro. He then shot 17-year-old Albert Leos, critically wounding him and running out of ammunition in the process. Huberty headed to the front of the restaurant to reload, giving Albert an opportunity to escape by dragging himself down the stairs to join a group of survivors hiding in the basement utility room. 2 other employees from the group were also able to successfully flee down the stairway and through to an emergency exit. They managed to escape. Earlier that morning, Albert had actually contemplated not going into work that day, and instead joining his friends who invited him to hang out. But he felt it would be irresponsible of him, so he came into work instead. In the utility room, Albert would join 2 male and 3 female co-workers, one of whom was Wendy Flanagan, who had taken refuge there along with a woman and a baby. Once Albert arrived, he removed the shoelaces from his shoes and used them to make a tourniquet on his left arm, which was losing blood quickly. He bit down on a cloth to stifle his cries of pain to avoid putting the entire group at risk of being discovered. At one point, 11-year-old Aurora Pena, the young girl who was shielded by her 18-year-old pregnant aunt, was laying next to her slain aunt's body, cousin, and friends, and she felt that there was a lull in the shooting when Huberty was reloading. She opened her eyes. Huberty happened to be looking in her direction at the very same moment and noticed her open her eyes. He cursed at her, then threw French fries at her, and then shot her in the arm, neck, and jaw. Miraculously, she survived, but she would spend longer in the hospital than any other survivor. Because of this, Huberty thought others might be faking and playing dead, so he would return to shoot and kill other injured but still alive victims, like injured Jose Perez, who lay moaning in pain, his friend 22-year-old Gloria Gonzalez, and a young lady named Michelle Carncross, whom Huberty had already killed. By now, anyone still alive inside the restaurant wondered, where the hell are the police? At 5:05 p.m, over an hour after the first call to police was made, all responding law enforcement personnel were authorized to kill the assailant should they obtain a clear shot. At one point, the official green light to shoot was withdrawn, but it was again reinstated at 5:13 p.m. I think this clearly demonstrates the confusion and indecisiveness of law enforcement and lack of an existing plan on their part. It was around that time that SWAT sharpshooter Charles Foster positioned himself along with a spotter onto the roof of the post office just south of the McDonald's. He could see the bodies on the floor of the restaurant, but he could also see Huberty was at a significant advantage. Huberty had a clear view of the parking lot and the surrounding area, so anyone who tried to approach, even just to give aid to the people shot inside the restaurant, were driven away by gunfire. The windows of the restaurant were both tinted and coated with a laminate, so not only was it hard to see into the restaurant due to the tinting, but once the windows were shot at and shattered, the laminate held much of the glass in place, spidering the windows and creating an even more obstructive view. Further to the law enforcement's woes, at 5 p.m. the sun also began to wreak havoc on their ability to see into the restaurant, so Foster's job was a significant challenge. Foster didn't actually see Huberty until just before he shot him. As soon as Foster finally got a glimpse of Huberty through the restaurant's double doors, he didn't hesitate. The door's safety glass was fully shattered out by gunfire, and Foster could see Huberty's legs dangling as he sat on top of the cashier counter, reloading one of his magazines with ammunition. As Huberty hopped off the counter and began walking towards the shattered double doors, thus came Foster's vantage point. Huberty's head and neck were blocked by the door frame, but his chest and torso were not. At 5:17 p.m, Foster fired a single shot through Huberty's heart, killing him instantly. It was just one of 5 bullets fired by police throughout the entire duration of the massacre. The other 4 were also fired at the same time as Foster's, but they all missed the assailant. The ordeal lasted 77 minutes. The assailant expended 257 rounds of ammunition, mostly from the Uzi. 21 people were killed and 19 were injured. 17 of the victims were killed inside the restaurant and 4 were killed just outside the restaurant. There were only 10 uninjured survivors from the inside of the restaurant, 6 of whom were hidden inside the basement utility room. The youngest person killed was just 8 months old and the oldest was 74. While everyone was relieved the ordeal was over, no one had any idea of the devastation that they would find inside. Police entered, but were not prepared for what they saw. The carnage was unimaginable. Employees, customers, men, women, children, babies, their bodies lay everywhere. As SWAT Commander Jerry Sanders reflected, "I went through nightmares. So did a lot of the other guys. You can never, ever put that vision out of your mind." Survivors were removed from the restaurant and treated. Guadalupe Del Rio, who had been shielded by her two friends but was also shot herself, didn't actually realize that she'd been shot. An officer asked her afterwards if she was okay. She kept saying yes, and rather than alarm her, the officer took her to an ambulance where they treated her for the gunshot. Once the ordeal was over and the dust began to settle, the focus was on the police response time. Given that there were multiple types of firearms being shot, as well as conflicting descriptions of the perpetrator, police contended that it was unclear how many assailants were inside the restaurant. They also reported that they were unsure whether any hostages were being held. Several law enforcement officers stated that they thought it was a robbery gone wrong, and that the perpetrator was likely inside standing off with police and shooting out to police, but not shooting anyone inside. With the almost constant, near-deafening sounds of 257 rounds fired throughout the ordeal, including into stainless steel equipment, and the victims clearly being murdered just outside the restaurant, the claim that the police didn't know that people were being shot inside was incomprehensible to survivors. Victims and their families contended that individuals who escaped had informed police that there was just a single gunman, holding no hostages and shooting everyone he encountered on sight. Another point of contention between law enforcement and the victims and their families was the San Diego Police Department's initial report following the massacre. It indicated that everyone injured or killed within the restaurant had been shot by Huberty within the first 10 minutes after he had entered the restaurant. This claim was hotly disputed by survivors who stated that Huberty had shot both unwounded and wounded people over 40 minutes after he first opened fire, and that many were shot in the beginning didn't die right away and could have been saved if they received aid early on. They cited multiple instances where people were shot or reshot late into the rampage, including Jose Perez and Aurora Pena, who I mentioned previously. Ronald Herrera, who was shot by the gunman early on, then again 45 minutes later, as well as the group of employees Huberty found and massacred over 30 minutes after the massacre began. To this day, victims and their families strongly contend that waiting 77 minutes for help to intervene was a failure beyond measure that cost both injured and not yet shot victims their lives. While police contend that they responded appropriately given the information or lack of information they had at any given point, and also that they were tasked with weighing the safety of any hostages that might be inside, all amidst an unfamiliar, unprecedented, and unfathomably brutal scenario. In 1984, the San Ysidro Massacre at McDonald's was the worst massacre by a gunman in United States history at the time. As of 2023, it now stands at the 8th worst. In the wake of the tragedy, McDonald's Corporation suspended all of its advertising for the week following the massacre. Rival restaurant chain Burger King followed suit, suspending all of its advertising as well. Baby Carlita was a miracle baby. After the massacre, where she was handed over to a stranger, Marciela and Astolfo, who underwent surgery at different hospitals, would be separated from her for a full 2 weeks, all while not knowing whether baby Carlita had survived and were able to get connected with her or not. When they were reunited, doctors informed them that they had to remove part of Carlita's intestines and take out over 30 pieces of shrapnel. They said it was a miracle that she survived. Tragically, Astolfo would be murdered in 1990. Albert Leos, the young man who crawled down the stairs to safety and fashioned his own tourniquet, went on to become a police officer. He now proudly serves as a captain at the San Diego Police Department. In 1986, Etna Huberty filed lawsuits against McDonald's as well as Huberty's former employer, Babcock and Wilcox. She claimed that the fumes from Babcock and Wilcox and the food from McDonald's, specifically MSG, or monosodium glutamate, caused Huberty to undergo delusions and uncontrollable rage. Her lawsuits were both dismissed. Etna Huberty died in 2003 of breast cancer. Several family members of those killed, along with survivors of the massacre, filed lawsuits against McDonald's and the San Diego Police Department for negligence. Again, both the suits were dismissed, and on appeal the courts ruled in favor of the defendants. The courts ruled that McDonald's nor any other business has a duty of care to protect patrons from an unforeseeable assault by a murderous madman, and the implemented security measures typically used by restaurants to deter criminals, such as guards and closed-circuit television cameras, could not possibly have deterred the perpetrator, as he did not care about his own survival. The courts also released the San Diego Police Department of any culpability or negligence. They stated, in view of the sheer horror of the ordeal, it is difficult to imagine anything the police could have done or failed to do which would have made the risk any greater than that to which the victims were exposed before the police arrived. In 2014, 30 years after the tragedy, Huberty's oldest daughter, Zelia, gave an interview for the first time, having been just 12 years old at the time of the massacre. She recalls how she watched the bloody tragedy from her window. Remember, the Hubertys lived just a block away from the restaurant at the time. She said, "I had a perfect view of it. I saw the car there. I saw everything. I saw people I knew who I went to school with. I wasn't thinking anything at the time except, better them than me. I know that's a horrible thing to say, but as a 12-year-old, that's the sort of thing you think," she said. She also said that if she could turn back the clock, she probably would have killed her father before any of this would have occurred. Her life, she said, was not easy after the shooting. She shared how she was treated poorly by people whenever they found out who her dad was. She moved twice within a year after the shootings and went to school under an assumed name. Although she now uses her real name, she still gets comments. She was taken to city medicated therapy after the massacre, but considered the sessions a nuisance. Once they ended after 12 weeks, she never returned. She did have a fear for a while that she might turn into her father, seeing a lot of similarities between him and herself. But she recognized that she's educated, different, and that the acts he performed were a conscious decision. And the survivors. They were impacted too, whether from the ongoing pain of their injuries or the trauma of having lived through what no one should have to live through. They continue to suffer the aftermath. Through to this day, many struggle to function, being affected by loud noises, crowds, and just normal daily occurrences. And being in restaurants can be particularly frightening. One victim has stated anonymously how her first thought whenever she enters a restaurant to this day is, where are the exits? And she's on high alert the entire time. As a result of the massacre, the police developed special tactical teams to deal with mass shootings. They've also implemented active shooter protocol, where the object is to gain entry and take the shooter down as soon as possible. SWAT also has its own fleet of helicopters, SWAT officers dedicated to hostage rescue and special responses, increased training, more resources, more tech, and more expertise in such scenarios. After the massacre, McDonald's moved swiftly to make repairs, and within just 48 hours, they had repaired the McDonald's restaurant and were ready to reopen its doors. But the community outcry was swift. They wouldn't hear of it, and McDonald's Corporation reversed the decision. The building was demolished on September the 26th, 1984, and the McDonald's Corporation donated $1 million to the San Ysidro Survivors Fund. Amidst protests from San Ysidro residents and donors, the first financial payout from the fund was issued to Etna Huberty. Later, McDonald's Corporation also donated the property to the city, and in 1988, Southwestern College built a satellite campus in its place. Then in 1990, a monument was built to honor the victims of the massacre. The memorial was constructed of 21 hexagon-shaped granite pillars ranging in height from 1 to 6 feet, representing each victim, and a plaque lists their names alongside a heartfelt statement. Ironically and tragically, the San Ysidro Massacre has something in common with another more recent mass shooting in the United States, the Uvalde shooting in Texas. Despite the decades of time that passed between the two deadly massacres and the wealth of measures and protocols put in place, the response time before the perpetrator was brought down in both cases was exactly 77 minutes.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our show tonight. Be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform and subscribe to our show so that you never miss an episode. Our shows aren't sponsored by any company or corporation, so any support you can give us goes a long way in supporting the work that we do. From all of us here at Dead Souls, sleep tight.